Wizardry fans, I've got another guide here, mostly focused for new players, but might have some information for our veterans, and that's focusing on the different standard weapons in the game. So I want to focus on which ones are worth your time to use and invest, and why they're of use. So I'm going to start with just the one-handed, and then I'll go on to the two-handed weapons. There are some esoteric weapons like the katana or the kunai, but I'm just going to focus on just the regular weapons that everyone will have access to. Because all those other weapons, they're deep into the game. So, to start with, we have daggers. Daggers are, for the most part, terribly weak weapons that are largely useless apart from niche cases. Those niche cases are on the ninja class, where you can dual wield them and actually do massive damage there. Or you can use them on the thief, because the thief gets a skill where they can sneak attack. That sneak attack does a lot of damage, but it requires setup. You have to be hidden, and then you can sneak attack. So outside of that, which also uses a lot of SP, daggers are not really recommended. Then you have the one-handed swords. These are fantastic. Probably by far the best one-handed weapons, and you'll find even late game compositions you'll still be including one or more characters using these. What makes them so good is that they have two attacks. So a lot of one-handed weapons, they suffer from having low damage, so against things with armor you just do no damage, and more swords aren't any different in that regard. The fact they have two swings means their damage against something with low armor is actually higher than most two-handed weapons. They also have some pretty good bonuses. They have innate accuracy boosts and positive sphere evasion, so you can be a lot more accurate, and you could technically build an evasion tank using sword and shield. So when you combine the double attack and the fact they can have a shield in the other hand, it's a really solid kit. Right, next up, one-handed axes. As much as they're cool because everyone wants to be a Viking, they're pretty useless. Right, they might have slightly more damage than a sword, but they only swing once, so already you're at a massive disadvantage, and the trade-off they get is defense penetration, so they ignore a certain amount of the enemy's defense, but even against highly armored targets, it's still not enough to offset the fact you're only doing one attack. So unfortunately, these are pretty hard to skip. And lastly, you have one-handed maces, and these are pretty much the same as axes in that they're kind of terrible. So their damage is pretty woeful. They with -4 surety, that's essentially crit chance. That's actually massive. So these things just aren't landing critical hits. They're just woeful. They can inflict stun, which sounds amazing, but it happens so rarely that you can't rely on it. Even against like most basic mobs, it rarely comes into play. They do have evasion damage, but it's still not enough to carry it. What evasion damage is the description doesn't really make sense. But what it actually does is you essentially can't miss. What it does is if you do roll and you would miss, it'll still hit, but with a greatly reduced amount of damage. So it's would be a reliable weapon. The fact that this weapon's damage is so low, it's pretty useless. So when it comes to one-handed, you're pretty much using swords, or on niche cases, daggers. Now, two-handed weapons is where things come into play a lot more. So you have the greatsword. This is essentially very much like the sword, the one-handed sword, just one swing, but a lot more damage. You do have a minor action penalty debuff here, and it's not only an evasion thing, but still got high accuracy. You get bonus damage based on your strength as well, which is what really carries the two-handed weapons. Their damage over the one-handers is that it's one hit, so it's not getting hit as much from enemies' defenses, and you have the strength on top. So these do a fair bit of damage. They're accurate. They're just a good all-round two-handed weapon. But yeah, but it still does lots of good damage. Very similar to these is the axe. Now, unlike the one-handed axe, the two-handed axe is actually quite good. It's a little bit more of a niche weapon, so its damage is comparable to the greatsword, where it falls over though is -8 action speed is actually enormous, so you're slow, and -6 evasion means it's going to be a really hard time for you to dodge anything. So you probably want to stack a character wielding great axe with lots of armor. Where they make up for it is the defense penetration on the two-handed axe is actually really noticeable. So against a highly armored target, even the great sword, for instance, will be getting its damage will be greatly decreased, whereas the axe will do noticeably more damage. Where the axe falls over is against anything that isn't heavily armored. The great sword will do more damage, but the fact that it is a viable weapon. So if you had a great sword and a great axe, and the great axe had really great substats, the axe would be probably a better option. And then you have, where is it? The mace. The mace is really interesting. Whereas the one-handed mace is garbage, the two-handed mace is a deceptively strong weapon. So its attack power is lower compared to the great axe or the great sword. It also has some massive debuffs. So -8 action speed is huge, -6 evasion is nasty, and -4 surety means again you're gonna have a very hard time landing critical hits. Or it can even lead to the point where you just can't crit unless you have outside buffs. But where it goes hard is the evasion damage here. It means you can't miss. So if you do miss, you'll still do a percentage of your regular damage. So, and the stunning happens more with the two-hander than with the one-hander. But again, even with a character like that has really high strength, let's say Geralf, he's a fighter who even specializes in two-handed maces, he still rarely stuns. But when it does happen, it's nice, but you think of it as a bonus. What you really want to hear is the evasion damage stat, which just means you can't miss. So it's a very consistent weapon. And so that means it is reliable. But would you use it over the great axe or the great sword? I think it's really character dependent. So on a character like I mentioned, Geralf, who has bonuses to the mace, it is a significant difference. Like if you do a heavy strike with a great sword or the two-handed mace with him, it's about a 50-ish damage difference, which is quite large. And as for the last two-handed regular weapons, the polearms, spears, these are actually my personal favorite because they do a lot of different things. So their base damage is a bit lower, equivalent to the hammer. But you'll notice they have no negatives. They don't hit your action speed, your evasion, or your surety. If anything, they should give you 4 evasion, which is almost as much as a one-handed sword. They also have massive accuracy bonus. So you're accurate, you're able to build a dodge tank or an armor tank, depending on what your build is. And with strength base, they're still doing much more damage than a one-handed weapon. What's really neat about them though is they're considered a medium range weapon. So what that means is if you have one of your characters on the front row with a spear, they can melee attack the second row of enemies, or even the third row in those cases, without any penalty. Normally attacking a secondary row with a melee attack, you're at a half damage straight up, while the spear doesn't suffer that penalty. Or if you have a character with a spear in the second row, you can attack the front row without penalty. So it's a really versatile weapon it has some defensive boosts, it's really accurate, you can poke wherever you want to go, so I love this weapon. Right, so that's it out of the regular ones. So the most common ones used are the one-handed sword and the great sword, and then it's more about personal preference, whereas I love the spear, you have some people that love the two-handed maces or the two-handed axes. Bows, I was tossing up whether to include them in this list or not, simply because there's no other alternative weapon outside the kunai for the ninja, and it just does what you expect it to do. It's a really useful weapon if on, say, a thief with heavy strike, precision strike. It just does good damage. You can, with a high speed stat, you can generally use them to snipe enemy casters off before they can move. So it's a really useful weapon to have, and will generally outdamage the dagger, which is the other weapon you might choose on a thief, considerably, unless you go to the setup of trying to sneak attack. As for major weapons, again, there's not a whole lot of consideration. You go difference between one-handed and two-handed staff. So the difference is the one-handed staff, they do boost your magic and divine power, so for mages and priests. you don't really hit things with them. They're pretty useless, but same as two-handed. So the real difference is the two-handed staves do give a lot more magic and divine power boost with a slight evasion penalty. So generally the difference is, do you want to power up your attacks and heals, or do you want to make your mage a little bit more survivable by giving them one-handed staff so they can hold a shield? Now, given that the shields can be magical and therefore have bonuses to, like your divine power or your magic powers, means you can bridge the gap between the two with gear. So, as a general thumb, I tend to just give my priests and mages a two-handed staff, unless I find a really good one-handed staff and shield that combo together well. Alright, if you're wondering why I chose Undead Bane weapons, is because that's the one tier of weapons I had that are all the same, so you could just compare the damage numbers of each. That's really about it. Just wanted to give a brief rundown of all the different weapon types, their advantages, disadvantages, and whether you should invest precious gold and ore into upgrading them, or possibly just skip them. Alright, I hope this was helpful to everyone. If it was, slap the like and subscribe and all that jazz, and I'll see you in the next one.